Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, wir freuen uns, dass Sie im Ludwig-Forum sind und begrüßen herzlich Donna Dennis, die heute Abend hier ist, bei uns in Aachen. Sie ist eine langjährige Weggefährtin und Freundin von Rosemary Meyer und in Springfield, Ohio geboren, lebt aber schon seit 1949 in New York, wo auch Rosemary Meyer lebte, und ist eine der ersten Künstlerinnen, die in den 70er Jahren Architektur und Skulptur zusammenbrachte. Wir sehen ja auch hier direkt neben uns diese wunderbare Arbeit Subway Station with Yellow and Blue von 1975, die Peter Ludwig bereits 1976 in der Galerie Holly Solomon, eine Galeristin, die sehr viele Künstlerinnen in New York förderte in der Zeit. Und mit dieser Arbeit, vielleicht erzähle ich ein ganz bisschen was über diese Arbeit, weil wahrscheinlich wird die gar nicht Gegenstand sein heute. Und dann ist das Licht ganz schön. Möchte Donna Dennis ihre Aufmerksamkeit auf das richten, was unsere Wahrnehmung im Alltag häufig verborgen bleibt. Es ist eine sehr typische Arbeit für sie, eben solche Architekturen, die als Skulpturen dargeboten sind. Dennis spielt bewusst mit der Sichtbarkeit von Oberflächen und Fassaden, von etwas Großem Unbekannten und verweist mit einer Spaltöffnung in der Oberfläche auf etwas Verborgenes. Man sieht zwar Licht am Eingang, aber ebenso auch noch nicht erleuchtete Glühbirnen, die auf ungenutzte Energiereserven hinweisen. Dem liegt auch ein feministischer Gedanke zugrunde bei ihr, der seit den 1970er Jahren, wie eben auch bei Rosemary Meyer, starken Einfluss auf ihre Arbeiten hatte. Die Entdeckung und Freisetzung von Potenzialen, Möglichkeitsräumen soll die Ermächtigung der Frauen zum Ausdruck bringen. Sie hatte auch mal erzählt, dass sie das Ganze auch als wie ein Selbstporträt sieht. Deswegen hat es auch diese Höhe, die sie damals hatte, als sie das fertigte, eben eine menschliche Höhe. Um 1970 lebte sie in Little Italy, nur einen Block von Rosemary Meyer entfernt, in New York. Zwei junge Künstlerinnen in einer wahrscheinlich der spannendsten Zeiten in der New Yorker Kunstwelt, von denen sie uns heute erzählen möchte. Ja, so übergebe ich auch direkt an Donna und vielen Dank und viel Spaß.
Thank you. And I am very happy to be here. I've been having a good time and it's an honor. And it's so great for me to see this piece of mine that I haven't seen in decades. And it's so well cared for and still looks good to me. So, I'm going to start out just giving a little introduction, and then I'll go through the images, more or less in chronological order, and mostly I'm going to talk a little bit about, so Rosemary and I really started being close friends in 1971, but first I'll show some images from our lives, our separate lives up to that point. And then, so I'll keep this image of Rosemary and me on the screen. This was probably in the 1980s, but one thing we shared was a love of our cats. I'd never had cats before. I never had any pets. I always say I had little sisters. But anyway, we both had cats, and our cats both had kittens. So that was one of the things that bonded us early on. A little something I wrote. I believe that I first met Rosemary Meyer in 1965. The poet Ted Berrigan soon to become my boyfriend, took me one night to visit Rosemary and her husband, the then poet and later visual artist Vito Acconci. I remember a narrow, long, low-ceilinged space in an old 2- or 3-story building on the Bowery. What impressed me the most was that the walls were lined with books, seemingly as far as the eye could see. I think the men talked that night. I don't remember talking with Rosemary. In the fall of 1970, I moved from an apartment on St. Mark's Place in the East Village to a building in Little Italy on the corner of Grand and Mulberry Streets, a live-work space that was the first space I had ever had that was not shared. Rosemary had moved to a building at the corner of Broome and Mulberry Streets with Vito in 1966. When they separated, Rosemary stayed on. It was her home and the place where she made her work. I believe it was her sister, the poet Bernadette Mayer, who said to me, "My sister lives just a block from you." And so Rosemary and I came into one another's lives at what was the most formative time for us as young artists. We visited back and forth regularly. When one of us finished a work, we would invite the other over for dinner and a look. We spurred one another on. It was the best kind of competition. So now a little background. Rosemary was born in 1943, grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and attended Catholic schools. I was born in Springfield, Ohio in 1942 and moved to the suburbs of New York a few years after my father came back from World War II. I attended public schools and then went to Carleton College in Minnesota, where I majored in art. Rosemary went to a Catholic girls' high school in Brooklyn, and then I'm a little foggy. I know she went to college and studied classics, majored in classics, I think, and I can't quite remember. It might have been Iowa. But she also, as a young woman, went to the Brooklyn Museum classes and then the School of Visual Arts, where she met the artist Adrian Piper, who became a friend. I had decided when I was 6 that I wanted to be an artist. My family had always supplied paper that my father brought home from his office and crayons. I was praised by art teachers at school, but I had no idea what it was like to make a life as an artist. According to her niece, Marie Warsh, Rosemary had decided in the early 1960s that she wanted to make a life as an artist, so it came to her a little bit later. Up until the point we met and became friends, our paths had been different in important ways, but we had some common experiences that prepared us for close friendship in 1971. The first public exposure of our work for both of us was, I believe, as covers and reading announcements for our poet friends. I designed covers for Anne Waldman, Ted Berrigan, Louis Warsh, and others. Rosemary designed covers for her sister Bernadette, her husband Vito, and others. By 1971, I had broken up with Ted, and Rosemary was separated from Vito, although they remained friends, as did Ted and I. Rosemary and I were both poor. I had lost a full-time 9-to-5 job as a photo editor during a recession and found another, but always ran out of money before Friday payday. Rosemary had had a 9-to-5 job, but early in 1971 went on unemployment, which more or less paid the bills, but troubled her and sometimes gave her more time than she knew what to do with. To make ends meet, we both modeled for the painter Raphael Sawyer. He made paintings and drawings of us both individually and together. Rosemary's marriage with Vito ended in 1968. I had had the relationship with Ted Berrigan that was ending when I moved to Grand Street in 1970. We were both at times lonely, but we also loved our privacy to think and quietly make art that our spaces afforded us. We were both discovering the pleasures of shopping for food in Little Italy and nearby Chinatown, of inviting friends over for dinners. And I think in the exhibition here, there's one of Rosemary's dinner books where she recorded who came, what they ate, in beautiful graphics. Minimalism is what we both saw when we went to galleries. And both of us were finding our way in that male-dominated milieu. During 1971, Rosemary had to answer to responses from friends who came to see her work, particularly Adrian Piper and Vito, who called her work too pretty. During the year, she came to accept the prettiness of her work. She called it prettiness. The colors, the softness, and the necessity of beauty. There were some things in minimalism that I liked, but it seemed that it gave me nowhere to go. A defining moment came when a poet I knew published a book that consisted of a ream of paper with one word in the middle of the top page. What to do after that? There seemed to be so many rules, so many, you can't do this and you can't do that. It seemed to me that making art should be about wide open possibilities. When I decided that as a woman, I had very little to do with what had come before, with art history as known then, that art history as known then, made by men. So I remember my textbook in art history in college had, I think, not a single work by a woman. I can't remember, but it was a classic that was taught everywhere. That book was required everywhere, so I felt free to make my own way. I became interested in the idea of what kind of art would women make, unimpeded by art history, as it was then known. The women's movement was in the air. I believe both Rosemary and I had read Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. It had turned my life around 360 degrees. I had stood utterly thrilled on the sidelines of the first Women's March down Fifth Avenue, August 26, 1970, and vowed the next year I'd be back marching too. In 1971, Rosemary and I did just that, and we both wrote about it in our journals. That was another thing we had in common. We both kept journals. And during 1971, we both participated in a consciousness-raising group and wrote about that, our experiences of it, our hopes and expectations of it. I had been instrumental in beginning a group earlier in the year, which was a different group. Actually, by the summer of 1971, I was in 2 groups and considering being in a third, and then I thought that's nuts. But the group that survived and that Rosemary and I were in together that's the one I continued with. So I saw I guess what I'm going to continue here saying is I had strong ideas about following procedures for the consciousness-raising group. There was a real structure that you were supposed to follow, and it felt very political to me, and it was about gathering evidence of harassment, exploitation, experiences we'd all shared, and getting stirred up and active about that. Rosemary, from evidence in her journals, was looking more for companionship and a sense of what she had in common with other women and what set her apart. We both wrote about the meetings in our journals. During 1971, we both read Anais Nin's diaries and commented on them. We shared a disappointment that she never wrote of where her money came from. We both desperately needed to know more, and about how successful women writers and artists had navigated the practicalities of their lives, and Nin offered almost nothing. She annoyed us no end. We both read Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch, which talked about how easily a work of art is lost when it is not valued in the artist's lifetime. I think in both of our bodies of work, we dealt with a sense of loss, the loss of so much talent, the loss of all of society, of the gifts that women across the centuries might have been able to offer if only their lives had been valued. Rosemary's naming of her works, Hypatia, Roswitha, bringing stories forward, bringing names lost to history, sprang from that impulse, I think. And my focus on vernacular architecture not valued as architecture, and therefore easily lost over time, had a similar root. So now, whoops, I have to remember to stay near the microphone. So now I'm going to show images of some of the things I've been talking about. This is Rosemary and Vito at their wedding. They were teenagers. They were very young. It took place in Brooklyn. This is Rosemary in her studio. This is Adrienne Piper, one of her very early performances that took place at Max's Kansas City on, I believe, a Saturday afternoon. And Rosemary was the documentary photographer who followed her around. I'm not remembering the name of this piece at the moment, but this was a piece that she made before she and I became close friends. She was working with paint and fabric at that point. And here I am in the late 1960s, maybe 1970, where I made these assemblage pieces. I was interested in light and mirrors. And this is the building that Rosemary had moved to with Vito in Little Italy. It's over something called Roma Cafe. Yeah, Cafe Roma. And as I remembered, she lived in the left-hand part of the Cafe Roma property. And I think it was the three windows to the left over the storefront. Her place always smelled of pastries. And there's Cafe Roma sign to the left, and that Little Italy had frequent noisy festivals. And if you were to walk down the block, the end of the block, through the crowd, you would get to my place, which has been renovated since I lived in it. This is a more recent picture, but I lived on the 3rd floor at 182 Grand Street. I think I had the 2 windows on the left on the 3rd floor. And so now we're in 1971, and Rosemary was making a series of pieces she called veils, working with fabric and paint, but in unexpected ways. And I think this was the last of her veils series done early in 1971. And this is one of my journal pages. I was thinking about screening summer sounds, summer evenings. And I think there were a number of artists experimenting with using fabric in sculptures or on the wall. And I'm trying to remember the name of, Alan Shields was somebody I think Rosemary and I both liked. But I was also doing this, I think, because I was inspired by Rosemary. I hadn't yet found exactly what I was going to be doing. And you can see here I write, not nearly there yet. But I'm thinking of little structures with screening or something over them, fabric over them. But I was also doing collages, and this is one. I showed you an image of me standing in front of a very large work, but for various reasons, I lost my nerve on that, and so I was now working very small and sort of starting over. So this was a collage I made for a book Ann Waldman and collaboration Ann Waldman and Ted Berrigan, but it ended up a little too complex for easy reproduction, so I ended up doing a different one, but I always liked this. That's me. I gave myself red hair. I didn't actually have red hair, but and this is a Ted Berrigan announcement for a reading. And this one is Gerard Malanga, poet, and Patti Smith, the known Patti Smith. And this was for poet Jim Carroll and the famous Lou Reed. But we were all sort of hanging out in the same milieu at that time. Here's another self-portrait, which I think I didn't know at the time, but it's starting to point toward my interest in architecture, because this is 4 for $1 photo booth pictures of myself, but next to the last little square, I put the corner of a room, and then I crowned myself with a rhinestone. Another little collage painting. And here in my journal page, I write that that Rosemary had some new works I like a lot. Prettier colors, but nightmare glowing colors. Some knotted. She's going to try some small works after seeing mine. Of course, her work was the main inspiration for my tent work. Give and take like that is so beautiful. And I know in her journal she talks about buying some magazines, because I was using magazines for collages, but I don't think anything ever came of it, but it was a momentary idea she had. And this is a piece she made, I think, in that year called Knots. And this was my first little sculpture ever. I called it Ghost Incubator. It's only about this big. It was a stocking stretched over a little frame and 2 little ghosts hanging inside. Another work of Rosemary's from that time. She was doing a series of drawings. Some of them were labeled impossible drawings, things that couldn't be made, but gave her a freer rein in her drawing and her ideas. And then a piece that hung on the wall with actual fabric. And I wrote in my journal, Rosemary's new drawings make me think of Pontormo, mannerism, or my something of, I was really scrawling here, twisted cloth. Okay, now I mentioned the Women's March down Fifth Avenue, August 26, 1970, and the second one was 1971, and Rosemary and I were there. We were a little bit disappointed for different reasons, but we were there, and that was important. And then AR Gallery was just being formed in 1971. The women who had this idea and were putting it together and visiting women's artist studios, because AIR was the first women's cooperative gallery in the country and perhaps in the world. And here's a meeting. Lucy Lepard was a writer, critic, who was, I think, very important in putting this idea forward and supporting the women who were working to create the gallery. So, and there were not only exhibitions, but important meetings and events. This is the founding group of AIR, and Rosemary is in the lower right corner. And she sent the women to my studio, and they liked the work, but they said that they felt I didn't have enough for a show, which was true, and they wanted to come back. But that didn't happen, but by 1975 I was with a pioneering woman art dealer named Holly Solomon, with whom I showed that piece. But I got to know most of the women through Rosemary, most of the women who were a member of the AIR collective. So this is our consciousness raising group, the core, and this was in 1981. We had a reunion at my place. So I'm standing, Adrian Piper, Grace Murphy, who got a degree in psychology. She'd gone to high school with Rosemary and Bernadette, and then Jane Weiss, a friend of hers, she brought and became a key member of the group. And just more amusing pictures of our reunion, Rosemary and Adrian, me with my kitchen, my loft kitchen. I think I had a stove by then. Before that, it had just been a hot plate. Adrian and Jane having a good time, singing, I think. And there's Rosemary and me. And one last picture, Rosemary standing next to the unfortunate red streak, but there's the group. And there was one member of the group who couldn't come to the 1981 reunion because she was in Los Angeles, and she went off to Los Angeles and really started as a script girl or something like that, but ended up being an important director. And the film I think she's best known for is Children of a Lesser God. And that was so well received that she had an opportunity to meet Prince Charles, So there she is. And Carlos Castaneda this book was being widely read by artists anyway, and we all in the group read it and were quite influenced by it. Rosemary wrote that it was a very important book. And then I mentioned modeling for Raphael Sawyer, the painter, who was a very tiny man, but with a big heart. And there's Rosemary and Raphael, and there's a painting you can see in the background of both pictures, a painting he was working on of Rosemary and me, and here's the painting. And then a portrait he did of Rosemary. And a group painting he called Portraits at a Party. And Raphael and his two brothers, who were also painters, are forming a little trio in the right. They were all tiny. And Philip Perlstein, the painter, is in the front. Mimi Gross, who with her husband Red Grooms, did important early installations. And then I'm on the left in a kind of gray dress, and Rosemary is facing me, and the painter Alex Katz is looking out across us. I don't know if he's ignoring us or what, but he was a friend too. And then in my journal, I congratulated myself on my 29th birthday, October 16th, 1971. And I wrote, terrific new work in my head. So by the end of 1971, I was beginning to get more of a sense of what I really was heading for, what I might be doing. And then I wrote in my journal that Rosemary says whenever she thinks of me, she thinks of clouds and sky. And here's a journal page where I started to have all kinds of ideas late in the year. And I mentioned some influences, H.C. Westerman, Bert Hoffman, who's actually Robert Wilson, was beginning to put on lavish, incredibly wonderful performance pieces. And then I wrote at the bottom, and I was beginning to think of, I call them attractive traps, kind of lures, traps. And I wrote houses. I've been moving toward this all year. And here, in a page not long after, I wrote about some things, some people or artists I could thank for this new sense of what I was going to do, people who had been important with their work. So I wrote Rosemary, fabric, H.C. Westerman, house, Bird Hoffman, house, can't quite read that. Anyway, and the teachings of Don Juan. So I'd had that little ghost incubator piece that looked like a tent. Now I was stretching fabric over a little frame that looked like a house. And then I started to imagine maybe a bigger kind of house-inspired work. And on this page, and the images of, because I was really connecting with my childhood and all the things that I had most loved to do when I was little, which was to make houses out of almost anything, out of snow, out of leaves, raked to form the foundation of a house. And I had wonderful blocks to play with as a child. So I actually went back to my parents' house and I got the blocks and I thought about using them as a starting point. So that's what the image is. And then I wrote, maybe what I'm after is an interior which one can see into but can't, and the next page, enter. So that's kind of what you have there. And this actually, sometimes ideas start and then I go away from them and then I come back and I think it's a new idea, but I actually had it before. I'd say this is the starting point for that piece because I say a stairs that disappears right up into the second floor with no access. And that's a stairs that goes up and seems to go nowhere. And then the back seems to go somewhere you can go down. And then very early, where I was starting to think about making these false front pieces, just page of inspiration. And then I actually had a dream about little houses and seeing all sorts of little houses in a field. And I woke up from the dream, I think it was in the afternoon, and I wrote in my journal, maybe I should be an architect. But I didn't do that. And I don't think it would have suited me. Because I like to make things where I have no restrictions. I wouldn't want to have to think about, building codes and things like that. It's not my thing. And I thought of these as false fronts. I think I also thought of them, when I started to build them, I thought of them as shaped canvases, still as paintings. But they stood on the floor. And then I made a little diorama box, I think partly inspired by Joseph Cornell, who I'd like to look at a lot. And Rosemary wrote in her journal that she didn't like this box, and she didn't know how to think about it, and that my work was so subconscious that you didn't know, it was hard to know how to talk about it or think about it. But I liked the little box, and so I started to make plans to make it bigger. And here's drawings where I'm trying to figure out measurements. And then I was trying to figure out the scale. This was the very first one, and I had different framings for the doors. But I eventually ended up, I think as I said, making the idea there were self-portraits, and so the top of the door would come to my eye level, and then the piece would just be a little bit taller than that, perhaps 6 feet. So I did cut this piece down. This photo, or standing there, told me it was not quite the right size. And that's the finished piece. And then it was Christmas time, and Rosemary made a drawing for me. Silly one to keep you smiling. And I gave her a kind of Advent calendar. And I wrote in my journal that I gave her an alarm clock because her cats had destroyed her alarm clock, and she would ask, so it was kind of a joke because she was often asking me to call her and wake her up at 8:30 in the morning. And now we're in late, I think the very end of 71 and moving into, and I think this piece, no, I didn't. I tried to have a list of the names of Rosemary's works. I do have it. So I hope I get them right. I think this is Hypatia. So this was January 1972. So now we're out of the year of the diaries, but I'm going to take you quickly through 72 and into early 73, which is when both of us had our first solo shows. And this is a drawing for De Medici, February 72. And then the wall piece that she made by the same name. And this is a drawing for net section, spring of 72. And then net section, and people who know better right now would have the names and correct me if I start getting off here. Net section, spring of 72, a fabric piece. And then Abracadabra, sailboat. and then a fabric piece balancing. And then in 1972, I'd made that first false front, or I completed it, and then I just knew I was onto something that I could go with for a long time. So I decided I'd make more of these false front pieces. So I did a lot of drawings. Some of them very fantastical, some of them not so much. But it was a very fertile time for me, drawing. Something kind of crazy. I think this was sort of inspired by Saul Steinberg. And then I imagined they'd multiplied and gone up a hill. And I thought of the first ones as tropical, but then I imagined a northern city. And then I began to, so now it's, both Rosemary and I are preparing for our solo shows in the spring of '73. And after we'd helped one another install our work, Rosemary said, let's never have shows at the same time. But we were both really helpful to one another, but it was stressful. So this is, I call Hotel Pacifica. First time I used an electric light. I love Dan Flavin's work, so that's partly what was going on there. And I wanted to make paper palm trees. I think partly Robert Wilson's work. I know partly Robert Wilson's work was an inspiration. And so this was the show I had in the spring of 1973. It was also in a co-op gallery, but not AIR. And I called it Hotels. And I had the sounds of jungle birds, and a friend in theater said, do you want the sun? And he said, let's just have all these lights facing people. Some people didn't like it, but it felt hot, and I liked the way it worked. And now this, last night at dinner here, I discovered that there are two drawings that I had no idea were here. They'd been collected a long time ago. So I got to see them today. And I just took very informal photos, but this was one of my favorites from around the time I made it. And now we're back to Rosemary's work called Endless Work, December 1972. And I think it was around that time she was invited to show at AIR Gallery, become part of the co-op. And so it really energized her in a big way. So I think this is Semiramis or Semirami, November '72, and a drawing bent rods. So soon she was going to start taking her pieces off the wall and using wooden frame or wooden rods to let them come out into the space. And it was a big, important step. This is Roswitha, and her work is now out, hanging in the space. So both of us had started, I think, as painters on the wall, and we both found ways to move out into the room. And Gala Placidia, which she showed at her first, Roswitha and Gala Placidia, I know she showed at her first one-person show at AIR. And it was really spectacular. There was nothing like this being seen anywhere. And this is Hypsipyle. I think I'm pronouncing that right, 1973. And some of you will have been into our show and seen some of these pieces, which look really wonderful here. They look the best I've ever seen them because the space is right, the lighting is right, the color of the walls is right. It's great to see. So here's my piece here, And Marie Warsh, Rosemary's niece, who has been so instrumental, along with her brother Max, in bringing Rosemary's work forward. Rosemary died in 2014, so bringing her work up to people's attention. And one of the things they did was publish Rosemary's journals from 1971. All these Post-its are where I or consciousness raising group meeting is mentioned. So. And just a little more on the piece you see of mine. Here I am working on it. It's a context sheet, and a portrait somebody took of me. And this was a later piece, Subway with Silver Girders, that went to the Venice Biennale, my first big piece. But the focus of the picture is Marie Warsh, Rosemary's niece, who Rosemary brought her over when she was a little girl, and I let her go into this piece, Subway with Silver Girders. There she is again. And I don't know how she got in there, but it makes a great little picture. And I think that's the end of my images. So, but there might be some questions or